In the early decades of the 20th century, New York City pulsed like a living organism, loud, restless, and hungry. It was a place where fortunes were made in daylight and stolen in the shadows, where immigrants stepped onto the docks believing they had found a new world, only to discover that survival demanded more than hope. In this chaotic landscape, stitched together with ambition and fear, one name would eventually rise above the noise: Charles Lucky Luciano. But before he became the architect of modern organized crime, he was simply another face in the crowd, another boy navigating a world that rewarded cunning far more than innocence. The story begins in smoke-filled streets where gangs were not legends but everyday threats, where policemen looked the other way for a few dollars, and where corruption was not an anomaly, it was the system. And in this world, power was not inherited, it was taken. Luciano understood this long before anyone realized he was watching, studying, and learning. He observed not just violence but the patterns behind it. He watched how people responded when they were afraid, how they negotiated when desperate, how alliances formed and how betrayals were justified. Even as a child, his mind worked like a strategist's, long before he had the vocabulary to describe what he was becoming. As the city roared around him, Luciano saw something few others could: a blueprint hidden inside the madness. Where most saw brutality, he saw inefficiency. Where others sought control through fear alone, he recognized the power of networks, organization, communication. The old Mafia bosses were obsessed with tradition and hierarchy. Luciano would become obsessed with evolution. His life would be defined by one relentless idea: that the underworld did not need to be a battlefield. It could be a corporation. Structured, predictable, profitable. And he would be the one to build it. But every architect begins with an awakening, and for Luciano, that awakening was forged in moments of danger that could have ended his life before it truly started. There were nights when he walked home past alleys where knives flashed as quickly as whispers. Days when police raids scattered the young and the reckless like broken glass. He grew up surrounded by men who believed power came solely from violence, yet he would discover that true influence required something far more complex. Violence could make people fear you. But structure, predictable, systematic control, could make them obey you. Even then, he carried the quiet confidence of someone who knew he was meant for more than street scraps. He didn't just want to survive the world he had been thrown into. He wanted to redesign it. And fate, timing, and ambition would align in such a way that his name would echo through decades of criminal history. But in the beginning, before the commission, before the rise, before the betrayals and the legacy, he was simply a young man walking through a fractured city, collecting insights the way others collected scars. This documentary opens not with the myth of Lucky Luciano but with the man, ambitious, observant, and dangerously intelligent. The kind of intelligence that does not shout but quietly reshapes the world around it. His story is not simply the tale of a criminal but of an engineer of power, a strategist whose mind operated like a machine built for influence. His decisions would transform scattered gangs into a national syndicate, replacing chaotic violence with organized order. He would change the Mafia from an ancient Sicilian tradition into a modern American enterprise. And he would do it with a level of precision that left both allies and enemies in awe. Yet every revolution begins in silence, in the mind of someone who dares to imagine a different world. Before Luciano put his blueprint into action, he first learned to survive in a world where trust was fragile, ambition was dangerous, and the difference between life and death could be a single misstep. The streets were not just a backdrop, they were his first classroom. The gangs his first teachers. Poverty his first motivation. Fear his first enemy. As you step into this story, you step into a world defined by contrasts: loyalty and betrayal, power and vulnerability, vision and violence. A world where one man would rise not because he was the strongest or the most feared but because he was the most strategic. This is the beginning of a journey that reshaped the criminal landscape of America. A journey that starts in a young boy's understanding of chaos and ends in the creation of an empire designed with the precision of a business titan. This is the world that created Lucky Luciano. And this is the moment before he began to remake it in his image. Before Lucky Luciano ever stepped into the underworld as a visionary, America's criminal landscape was a storm without a center. It was a chaotic, unregulated ecosystem of street gangs, ethnic enclaves, political manipulators and violent strongmen, all battling for scraps of power. There was no system, no long-term strategy, no shared rules, only survival. And in that world, the idea of an organized national crime syndicate was as unimaginable as skyscrapers to the first settlers. Luciano was stepping into a battlefield shaped by generations of mistrust and tradition, a place where brute force mattered more than coordination, and where every gang believed it stood alone. In the early 1900s, New York was a city caught between Old World habits and New World opportunities. Immigrants arrived daily, pouring into neighborhoods divided by language, culture, and poverty. Each group brought its own customs, its own sense of loyalty and honor, and inevitably, its own criminal elements. The Italian Mafia, the Jewish mobs, the Irish gangs, they each operated as isolated islands of power, protecting their own interests and clashing with anyone who dared step into their territory. The streets of the Lower East Side, East Harlem, and Little Italy became battlegrounds where alliances were temporary and grudges were eternal. Within the Italian underworld itself, a war of traditions raged. There were the Mustache Petes, older men from Sicily who carried their customs like sacred scripture. They operated by rigid rules born in villages across the Atlantic, rules based on respect for elders, family lineage, and unwavering loyalty to old country bosses. They distrusted anyone not Sicilian by birth. They avoided innovation, hated risk, and believed that business must be conducted strictly within their own ethnic boundaries. They were guardians of a past that no longer fit the world around them. But America was not Sicily. It moved faster. It rewarded ambition, not tradition. And the old ways created a mafia that was fractured, outdated, and constantly at war with itself. These older bosses treated crime like a family feud, not an enterprise. Their leadership style suffocated younger men with ideas. They clung to power but never understood the scale of opportunity that the American environment offered. The criminal world they ruled was violent, inefficient, and shaped by personal vendettas rather than strategy. While the Italians were fighting among themselves, other ethnic gangs were rapidly evolving. Jewish gangs, led by sharp minds like Meyer Lansky and Arnold Rothstein, were developing more modern methods: bookmaking, gambling structures, financial schemes. Irish gangs had strong political ties, often acting as muscle for corrupt politicians. And yet even they operated on a local scale, each group sticking to its own neighborhood. The idea of global reach, interstate coordination, or standardized operations didn't exist. Violence wasn't rare, it was routine. Shootouts erupted in markets, alleys, and bars with little warning. Territorial disputes could escalate into bloody wars lasting months or even years. Police forces were underfunded, easily bribed, and often ethnically divided themselves. A police captain loyal to the Irish gangs would turn a blind eye to their crimes but crack down on the Italians. Corruption filled every crack in the system and the public knew it. In some neighborhoods, people trusted gang leaders more than law enforcement, because at least gang leaders kept predictable rules. If you paid protection money, your business stayed safe. The city's underworld thrived because the official structures were collapsing under their own corruption. Into this mess stepped a new generation of criminals who understood the world differently. They didn't see America as a place to replicate the old feuds of Europe. They saw opportunity, limitless, unregulated opportunity. But they were still trapped within the cages built by the older bosses. Young men like Lucky Luciano watched the chaos of rival gangs and recognized how much money was being lost in the crossfire. He saw how pointless the ethnic divisions were, how destructive the vendettas became, and how unstable the entire criminal system was. These young men were surrounded by violence, but they already dreamed of something more structured, something that could turn constant warfare into constant profit. At the same time, prohibition was reshaping everything. When alcohol became illegal in 1920, the American underworld exploded with business potential. Overnight, small-time criminals found themselves running vast bootlegging operations. Speakeasies multiplied across the country. Ordinary citizens became customers of the underworld. Demand was massive, supply was illegal, and profit margins were unlike anything the criminals had seen before. But even this golden opportunity was being squandered. Gangs stole from each other, hijacked shipments, murdered rivals, and destabilized their own operations. There was money everywhere, but the lack of organization meant it was constantly slipping through bloody fingers. This was the world on the brink of transformation. A world that required a strategist, not another brute. A leader who could bridge ethnic lines, impose order, and see crime not as a street hustle but as a business model. The old mafia bosses couldn't imagine such a system. They were too invested in tradition to evolve. The Jewish gangs had the intelligence but lacked the cultural access to unite the Italians. The Irish had political influence but not the reach into immigrant communities. The underworld needed someone who understood all three worlds. Someone who could speak to the Sicilians, learn from the Jews, and collaborate with the Irish. That person would be Luciano. But before he rose, he absorbed everything around him. The failures of the old bosses, the ambition of the young gangsters, the corruption of the political machine, and the vast economic potential hidden in illegal markets. He studied the chaos not as a participant but as a future architect. He saw a criminal world drowning in mistrust and tradition, and he imagined replacing it with structure, cooperation, and ruthless efficiency. This was the landscape that set the stage for revolution, a fractured, volatile, power-hungry world waiting for someone to bring order to the disorder. And when Luciano finally emerged, he would redraw the underworld with lines so precise that organized crime would never be the same again. He arrived in America as a boy too young to understand what opportunity meant, yet old enough to feel the weight of survival pressing on his shoulders. Born Salvatore Lucania in Lercora, Sicily, his life began in a world scarred by poverty and violence. Sicily was beautiful, but beauty didn't feed families. Bandits roamed the countryside, landlords drained peasants dry, and the Mafia, far older than the American version, hovered like an invisible government. In that environment, young Salvatore learned one lesson early: no one was coming to save you. You either built your own path or you were crushed by circumstances. His father dreamed of giving his family a better life, and so they crossed the Atlantic into the unknown. New York was overwhelming. The noise, the crowds, the languages, the smells, everything hit him at once. The Lucania family settled in the Lower East Side, a neighborhood overflowing with immigrants, cramped apartments, and endless hunger. Poverty didn't just shape life there, it suffocated it. Children grew up faster because they had no choice. Young Salvatore found himself pulled into the rhythm of street life, a rhythm where fists were used more often than words. But unlike many kids around him, he did not simply react to the world, he observed it. He studied it with the quiet precision of someone who knew understanding meant survival. School offered little comfort. He spoke barely any English, was bullied for his accent, and quickly learned that respect came more from reputation than from textbooks. He began charging other kids nickels for protection, an instinctive early form of racketeering. And in these small acts, you can see the early blueprint of the man he would become. While others fought blindly, he used strategy. Where others bullied, he positioned himself as a necessary ally. By the time he was a teenager, he had already developed the social intelligence that would one day control empires. But the streets had other lessons to teach him, lessons written in blood. Violence erupted anywhere at any time. A wrong look, a misunderstanding, or a rumor could start a fight that ended with someone in the gutter. Young Luciano learned how to read people the way gamblers read cards. He could sense danger before it formed, recognize weakness instantly, and spot opportunity even in a crisis. This ability wasn't taught, it was born out of survival. When he stood on the sidewalks watching gangs roam the streets, he realized something deeper. Power wasn't about being the strongest. It was about being the smartest. And the smartest men didn't lead with fear, they led with advantage. In these years he also discovered ambition. Real ambition. Not the kind that dreams of a stable job, but the kind that hungers for absolute control. He saw the older Italian men working themselves to death for pennies. He saw mothers stitching clothes until their fingers bled. And he understood that the American dream was real, but not for people like them. If he wanted power, wealth, and freedom, he would have to take them. No one would hand them over. This mindset deepened when he began mixing with local gangsters. They noticed him, his confidence, his fearlessness, his charisma. He wasn't the biggest kid, but he had the presence of someone who knew exactly where he was going. And he was drawn to the underworld not because of its violence but because of its structure. Even in its chaos he saw rules: loyalty, territory, hierarchy, money flows. Street life had its own economy and he wanted to understand it fully. By the time he reached adolescence he was living between two worlds: the struggling immigrant household that wanted him to stay honest, and the dangerous street ecosystem that offered quick money and even quicker consequences. But Luciano was not reckless. He moved with intention, watching older boys make mistakes and mentally storing each one. Some got arrested. Others got killed. He didn't plan to join their fate. He planned to rise above it. And then came the turning point that pushed him deeper into the underworld. He realized charm could be more powerful than intimidation. Luciano had a natural ability to make people feel like they mattered. He listened more than he spoke. He learned names, paid attention to details. Even early rivals couldn't help but respect him. This skill would one day make him one of the most influential figures in organized crime, because he knew that alliances built willingly were stronger than alliances forced at gunpoint. During these years he met two boys who would forever change the shape of American crime: Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Their paths crossed in the cauldron of New York's immigrant neighborhoods, and something rare happened. three minds recognized each other's potential instantly. Lansky was brilliant, analytical, unemotional. Siegel was fearless, explosive, magnetic. Luciano was the bridge, the strategist, the future leader of this trio. Even as teenagers, they understood the criminal world better than many adult gangsters. They saw possibility where others saw limits. They were the new generation that would redefine everything. But before Luciano became Lucky, before he executed the moves that would transform the Mafia into a modern corporation, he was still just a young man searching for identity in a hostile world. He walked through streets filled with poverty and violence, yet his mind was focused on the future. He wasn't content to be another tough kid in the neighborhood. He wanted to build something that would outlast every gang war, every rival, every boss who thought the old ways were unbreakable. And in those early years, shaped by hunger, humiliation, ambition, and observation, the foundations of his destiny were laid. He learned what power cost, what survival demanded, what loyalty meant. And most importantly, he learned that the world did not reward the desperate. It rewarded the calculated. This was the rise of a street kid who would one day become the architect of organized crime. The boy who walked through chaos and quietly imagined order. The young mind already designing the empire he would one day command. By the time Charlie Luciano transitioned from adolescence into young adulthood, he was no longer just a street-smart kid. He was a force quietly reshaping the world around him. The chaotic neighborhoods of New York had honed his instincts, but now he was beginning to apply them with precision, turning survival into strategy. He understood that in the underworld, talent alone could get you noticed, but intellect and foresight could make you indispensable. Violence and intimidation were tools, but the real power came from influence, alliances, and the ability to anticipate both opportunity and threat. Luciano's rise was not immediate. It was methodical, built step by step on observation, experimentation, and calculated risk. He started small, as any ambitious young gangster would, taking part in petty thefts, protection schemes, and minor rackets. But unlike many of his peers, Luciano approached these ventures as lessons in human behavior and organizational structure. He studied the outcomes of every street fight, every betrayal, every successful collection of protection money. He began to notice patterns, how loyalty could be bought, how fear could be manipulated, and how reputation could operate as currency. For him, every incident was a case study, and every relationship a network of potential allies or threats. By the age of 20, Luciano had an almost uncanny ability to read situations before they escalated, making him both respected and feared among the gangs of New York. A pivotal element in Luciano's early rise was his approach to alliances. He refused to be constrained by ethnic or traditional boundaries in the way older bosses often were. Where the mustache Pete's clung to Sicilian heritage and old world customs, Luciano saw collaboration as a strategic advantage. He recognized that the city's criminal underworld was not a single monolith, but a patchwork of rival gangs, each with unique strengths and weaknesses. By building relationships across these groups, including Italian, Jewish, and Irish gangs, he created a network that was far more resilient and influential than any single organization. This approach would later become a hallmark of his leadership, a web of loyalty and interdependence that reinforced his power while minimizing direct conflict. Luciano's intelligence extended beyond alliances to his understanding of timing and opportunity. He was patient where others were impulsive, waiting for the right moment to act rather than striking immediately. This strategic patience allowed him to avoid unnecessary risks while consolidating influence. Early in his career, he recognized that openly challenging established bosses would be suicide. Instead, he cultivated a reputation as both loyal and capable, earning trust before slowly expanding his sphere of influence. In doing so, he mastered the art of perception, appearing as just another rising member of the underworld while quietly studying the mechanics of control, hierarchy, and power. In parallel, Luciano began refining his personal brand. He understood that image and perception were as vital as action. He cultivated charm, politeness, and a calm demeanor that disarmed potential enemies and inspired loyalty among peers. Unlike many street-level toughs who relied solely on fear, Luciano could inspire admiration, fascination, and even affection. People wanted to follow him not only because he was dangerous but because he projected competence, vision, and inevitability. This duality, simultaneously approachable and lethal, would later define his rule over the American Mafia. The Castellammarese War, which erupted in the late 1920s, provided Luciano with the perfect stage to demonstrate his strategic genius. As rival factions battled for supremacy, Luciano navigated the conflict with the precision of a chess master. He aligned himself with allies at the right moments, exploited weaknesses in the old guard, and orchestrated betrayals that eliminated threats without exposing himself to unnecessary risk. His role in the downfall of Joe Masuria, the reigning boss of bosses, was particularly telling. Luciano understood that brute force alone would not secure power. Instead, he combined careful planning, manipulation, and decisive action, ultimately orchestrating Masuria's assassination in a move that changed the hierarchy of the Mafia forever. During this period, Luciano also demonstrated a unique ability to integrate intellect with brutality. While he would not shy away from violence when necessary, his goal was always efficiency and long-term stability. Uncontrolled violence, he understood, destabilized organizations and wasted resources. Every act of aggression was calculated to achieve a precise objective, whether it was securing loyalty, eliminating a rival, or asserting dominance. In this way, Luciano distinguished himself from his predecessors. He was not merely a gangster but a strategist who treated crime as both a psychological and operational enterprise. By the early 1930s, Luciano had become indispensable to the operations of New York's criminal underworld. His reputation for strategic brilliance, combined with his ability to manage complex relationships across ethnic and organizational lines, made him a natural leader. He had mastered the art of influence, understanding that control could be exerted through persuasion, intimidation, or manipulation, depending on the situation. His rise was neither sudden nor accidental. It was the result of deliberate observation, calculated risk-taking, and a vision that extended far beyond the confines of street-level crime. At this stage, Luciano was already thinking several steps ahead. He imagined a world where criminal operations were coordinated, structured, and insulated from the chaos that had defined the underworld for generations. He began envisioning systems that could maximize profit, minimize conflict, and institutionalize loyalty, a blueprint for an empire that would later become the Commission. The young street kid who had survived poverty and violence had transformed into a tactical thinker, capable of orchestrating complex operations and seeing possibilities that others could not even conceive. This phase of Luciano's life marks the transformation from mere survival to deliberate mastery. The lessons of his youth, poverty, violence, observation, coalesced into a mindset designed for power. He had moved beyond being a participant in the chaos of New York streets to becoming an architect of its future. Every connection he made, every act of violence, and every calculated alliance served the larger purpose, establishing the foundations of a criminal empire that would endure far beyond his own lifetime. In doing so, Luciano was no longer just a rising gangster. He was a visionary in the making, a strategist whose ambition and intellect would reshape the underworld in ways that were unprecedented and enduring. As Luciano matured into his early 20s, his ambitions began to crystallize into something far more than personal gain. He no longer sought merely to survive the streets or to win temporary victories over rival gangs. He was beginning to think like an architect of power, a strategist who understood that lasting dominance required both vision and execution. This phase of his life was defined by a blend of intelligence, ruthlessness, and the capacity to inspire loyalty, an alchemy that would elevate him above every other figure in the American underworld. Luciano was no longer just reacting to circumstances. He was shaping them, creating the conditions under which he could consolidate influence, control resources, and design an empire. The foundation of his approach was relationships. Luciano recognized that raw force alone was insufficient to achieve lasting power. Violence could intimidate, but it could not build structure. He began to cultivate strategic alliances with men who shared his ambition, men who complemented his skills with their own unique strengths. Meyer Lansky, analytical and precise, brought a visionary understanding of finance and operations. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, impulsive and charismatic, provided the kind of fearless energy that could execute bold plans. Luciano was the unifying force between intellect and audacity, a leader who could coordinate disparate talents toward a singular goal. Together, they began to see opportunities where others saw chaos, and possibilities where others saw limitations. Luciano also challenged the traditional hierarchy of the Mafia. The older bosses, the so-called mustache Petes, adhered to strict Sicilian customs, valuing lineage, ritual, and age above capability. They dismissed innovation and feared collaboration outside their ethnic circle. Luciano, however, saw these limitations as weaknesses. He understood that power could be expanded by transcending old-world boundaries, creating alliances across ethnic lines, and recruiting talent based on skill and loyalty rather than heritage. This approach was revolutionary. It introduced meritocracy into a world previously governed by tradition, and it allowed Luciano to amass influence in a way that the older generation could neither anticipate nor counter effectively. One of Luciano's most defining moves during this period was his orchestration of the downfall of Joe Masuria, the reigning boss of bosses in New York. The Castellamarese War, a bloody conflict between rival factions, provided the opportunity. Luciano aligned himself with both internal allies and strategic outsiders, carefully calculating the timing and execution of the coup. He understood that killing Masuria would not merely eliminate a rival, it would signal a seismic shift in the underworld, a transition from old-world rigidity to modern, organized crime. The assassination was meticulously planned, executed without unnecessary exposure, and leveraged both psychological and strategic insight. By orchestrating this power shift, Luciano demonstrated his ability not only to survive but to manipulate outcomes on a massive scale. Luciano's vision extended beyond eliminating rivals. He sought to institutionalize power, to create systems that could manage operations efficiently and predictably. He began imposing discipline on criminal enterprises, introducing accountability, and structuring hierarchies to minimize conflict and maximize profit. This organizational genius transformed the perception of criminal activity from chaotic street-level violence into a sophisticated, business-like endeavor. He recognized that in order to maintain control over an empire, one needed more than fear. One needed respect, trust, and a framework that allowed multiple players to operate without constant infighting. Luciano's genius was to blend these elements seamlessly, creating loyalty through both incentives and intimidation, and ensuring that his influence extended far beyond his immediate presence. During this time, Luciano also demonstrated an acute understanding of the psychology of loyalty. He knew that men would follow him not just out of fear, but out of belief in his vision and confidence in his competence. He cultivated a reputation for fairness among allies, rewarding talent and punishing betrayal. This created a network of individuals who were invested in his success because their own survival and prosperity were tied to it. Luciano's ability to navigate human behavior with such precision distinguished him from other gangsters who relied solely on brute force or intimidation. The brutality of his environment did not diminish his strategic thinking. In fact, it sharpened it. Every confrontation, every betrayal, every street skirmish was a lesson in human behavior, negotiation, and the management of risk. Luciano learned to calculate consequences, anticipate reactions, and control variables in a world that seemed inherently unpredictable. His rise was not just about seizing opportunities, it was about creating them, engineering outcomes that ensured his ascendancy while minimizing exposure to danger. By the mid-1930s, Luciano's influence had expanded beyond the Lower East Side, reaching into Brooklyn, Manhattan, and even into the emerging gambling and bootlegging networks of New Jersey and Florida. He was no longer merely a participant in crime. He was a designer of criminal systems, a tactician who understood that the underworld, if properly organized, could be more profitable and controllable than legitimate businesses. He blended vision, strategy, and execution in a way that few had ever done, positioning himself as the central figure in a revolution that would redefine organized crime in America. Luciano's ascent during this period was marked not only by his operational acumen but also by his foresight. He anticipated shifts in law enforcement tactics, economic opportunities, and social changes, adapting his methods to maintain control and influence. He was building more than an empire. He was establishing a legacy. Every alliance he forged, every system he implemented, and every calculated act of violence served the larger purpose of transforming a fractured, chaotic underworld into an organized, disciplined network capable of enduring beyond his own lifetime. In essence, this stage of Luciano's life represents the convergence of intellect, ambition, and pragmatism. He moved decisively from the unpredictable life of a street gangster to the deliberate, calculated role of a criminal architect. He combined strategic vision with the operational execution necessary to achieve it, balancing the psychological dimensions of leadership with the practical realities of criminal enterprise. It was in this period that Luciano transitioned from a talented street operator into a man capable of orchestrating the most significant transformation the American Mafia had ever seen. A transformation that would define his legacy as the Don who did not just survive the underworld but reshaped it in his own image. Luciano's genius reached its pinnacle with the creation of the Commission, a structure so revolutionary that it would redefine organized crime in America forever. Up until that point, the Mafia operated like a fragmented battlefield, a patchwork of rival families engaged in constant warfare, suspicion, and unpredictable alliances. Leadership was dictated by tradition, fear, or lineage rather than efficiency, and the title of boss of bosses was more a symbol of power than a practical system of governance. This outdated model fostered endless bloodshed, weakened the underworld's profitability, and threatened the very survival of those who sought to dominate it. Luciano recognized that the only way to ensure long-term control and maximize profit was to replace chaos with structure, violence with strategy, and personal vendettas with institutionalized rules. The commission was his answer, a board of directors for crime that imposed order on what had previously been a lawless, unpredictable network of families. Each family retained autonomy over its territory and operations, but all disputes, major decisions, and profit sharing were subject to the oversight of this collective leadership. Luciano's insight was simple yet profound. Power was not just about eliminating rivals, but about creating a system where rivalry could be managed and even leveraged. By introducing negotiation, shared governance, and codified procedures, he transformed violent competition into predictable operations, ensuring that the underworld became more stable, disciplined, and ultimately more profitable. This structure required careful diplomacy and strategic vision. Luciano couldn't simply impose the commission on the established bosses. He had to convince them that cooperation would serve their interests better than continued conflict. He leveraged his reputation, his alliances with key figures like Meyer Lansky, and the vulnerabilities exposed by the Castellamarese War to bring previously warring factions to the table. By framing the commission as a vehicle for mutual benefit, Luciano mitigated resistance while simultaneously demonstrating his political acumen. His leadership was not just feared, it was respected because it delivered results. Less conflict, more profit, and a framework for long-term stability. The commission also institutionalized rules that would govern loyalty, arbitration, and succession, creating mechanisms to prevent the kind of destructive infighting that had defined the old mafia. Every major dispute, whether over territory, profit, or influence, would now be mediated by a council rather than resolved with bloodshed. This reduced unnecessary risk and reinforced the perception of the mafia as an organized enterprise rather than a chaotic collection of gangs. Luciano's vision extended beyond mere survival. He was designing a criminal organization that could function like a corporate entity, with checks and balances, accountability, and continuity across generations. Luciano's strategy wasn't limited to structural design. It extended into psychology. By positioning himself as the central architect of the commission, he cultivated loyalty, dependence, and influence over other powerful figures. Each boss recognized that working within the system enhanced their own security and profitability, making them invested in the stability Luciano provided. At the same time, his authority as the orchestrator of the commission allowed him to manipulate outcomes subtly, ensuring that no rival could gain dominance without his acquiescence. This was power refined, less about brute force, more about control, influence, and foresight. The impact of the commission on organized crime was immediate and profound. Murders between families decreased, operations became more efficient, and the mafia's reach expanded far beyond the traditional confines of New York. Profits surged in bootlegging, gambling, unions, and other ventures, while risks associated with conflict diminished. The commission allowed criminal enterprises to scale in a way that had been impossible under the chaotic old system. It introduced predictability into an inherently unpredictable environment, a feat that required both vision and exceptional leadership. Luciano's ability to balance autonomy with centralized oversight demonstrated his understanding that power is not merely seized, it is architected. Moreover, the commission transformed the mafia's social dynamics. By creating a council of peers, Luciano fostered a culture where influence was tied to strategy and loyalty rather than fear alone. Bosses who participated in the system were bound by its rules, creating a shared accountability that limited impulsive acts of violence. At the same time, Luciano retained the ability to manipulate alliances, settle scores discreetly, and subtly position himself as the central figure in a network of interdependent leaders. This dual approach, structure combined with personal leverage, was a masterstroke of psychological and organizational design. Luciano also anticipated future threats in a way that previous bosses could not. He understood that law enforcement, political pressure, and societal change would always pose risks to the underworld. By consolidating authority and creating formal mechanisms for negotiation, he reduced vulnerabilities, making the organization more adaptable and resilient. The commission allowed the mafia to operate efficiently while insulating its leaders from unnecessary exposure, creating a self-preserving system that could endure for decades. It was an innovation that elevated crime from an unpredictable, violent trade into a sophisticated enterprise capable of long-term planning and survival. The genius of the commission lay not only in its mechanics but in its symbolism. It signaled a new era. The old world of fear, blood, and uncoordinated violence was giving way to a modern, corporate-style mafia. Luciano had created a system that balanced autonomy with oversight, profit with loyalty, and ambition with discipline. By doing so, he had engineered an empire capable of sustaining itself long after any single individual, including himself, was gone. The commission was more than a council. It was the embodiment of Luciano's philosophy, that power is most enduring when it is organized, when it is systemic, and when it transforms chaos into opportunity. Through the creation of the commission, Luciano cemented his place as the architect of modern organized crime. He demonstrated that vision and intellect could achieve what violence alone never could: structure, stability, and scalability. He had taken the lessons of his youth, the observation of chaos, the analysis of human behavior, and the understanding of alliances, and applied them to create a system that would endure for generations. The commission was not just a governing body, it was a blueprint for power itself, a testament to Luciano's capacity to see the underworld not as it was, but as it could be. In that moment he did not merely rise to power. He redefined what power could look like, turning crime into an enterprise and himself into a legend. With the foundation of the commission in place, Luciano shifted his focus toward the very heart of his empire, the business of crime itself. He understood that power without profit was fleeting, and that an empire built solely on fear or reputation would eventually crumble. The streets, once his classroom, had taught him that opportunity and efficiency were far more valuable than brute strength. Luciano approached criminal enterprise with the mind of a businessman, analyzing markets, controlling supply, and mitigating risk. He transformed illegal activities from chaotic hustles into organized, highly profitable operations, turning what others saw as reckless ventures into structured, sustainable enterprises. Bootlegging during Prohibition was perhaps the most visible example of Luciano's early acumen. While other gangs fought over territories and territories alone, Luciano looked at the bigger picture: distribution networks, supply lines, and profit margins. He negotiated with manufacturers, organized transportation, and ensured that alcohol flowed efficiently from clandestine sources into speakeasies and underground clubs. Every shipment was accounted for, every partner vetted, and every risk calculated. Unlike other gang leaders who relied purely on muscle, Luciano saw the economic potential in cooperation. He understood that managing relationships with other criminal groups, corrupt officials, and suppliers was far more profitable than engaging in endless turf wars. But Luciano's vision extended far beyond bootlegging. He turned his attention to gambling, another arena ripe for systematic control. From underground poker rooms to elaborate betting operations, he implemented rules, standardized practices, and ensured that his enterprises were both profitable and predictable. He cultivated a culture where operators understood the system, adhered to its rules, and benefited from compliance. Cheating, stealing, or unauthorized expansions were met with swift consequences, but loyalty and efficiency were rewarded. In this way, Luciano created a network that was both disciplined and highly lucrative, a stark contrast to the disorganized operations of rival gangs. Union racketeering represented yet another frontier where Luciano applied his business-minded approach. Labor unions were a source of immense influence, controlling the flow of goods, labor strikes, and shipping routes. Many gangsters had exploited unions before, but often in haphazard, violent ways that drew law enforcement attention. Luciano, however, integrated criminal enterprise with legitimate structures. He established control over key unions, negotiating payoffs and strategic advantages while minimizing public exposure. Through careful orchestration, he ensured that unions became instruments of both profit and power, giving him leverage over entire industries and creating influence far beyond the criminal underworld. Luciano also recognized the potential in prostitution and vice, industries that had long operated in shadows but lacked cohesive management. Where others relied on violence and intimidation, Luciano applied organization, accountability, and revenue tracking. Brothels and escort operations were structured under strict rules, ensuring both maximum profit and minimal interference from rival gangs or authorities. Each operation was designed as a unit within a broader network, feeding into the larger empire while maintaining local control. This approach elevated criminal activity to a level of professionalism that made it far more resilient and efficient. Narcotics, though controversial even within the Mafia, were another area where Luciano demonstrated strategic thinking. He understood that the trade carried enormous profit potential but also heightened risk due to legal consequences and moral opposition from older bosses. Rather than abandoning the market entirely, he explored ways to control it indirectly, creating distribution channels and alliances that allowed him to benefit without exposing himself unnecessarily. This approach reflected his hallmark principle: maximize gain while minimizing vulnerability. Luciano's operations were not just about making money, they were about enduring, scalable systems capable of weathering legal, social, and intergang pressures. The unifying principle across all these ventures was Luciano's focus on predictability and efficiency. Unlike the old-school bosses who relied on instinct, fear, or brute force, Luciano treated crime as a business with measurable outcomes, organizational structures, and strategic goals. He standardized operations, monitored performance, and ensured that each branch of his empire contributed to the whole. Every transaction, alliance, and expansion was carefully calculated to strengthen his control while generating profit. In essence, he transformed the underworld into a vertically integrated enterprise, combining multiple revenue streams under centralized oversight while maintaining local autonomy. Luciano's success in these enterprises also relied heavily on his ability to manipulate human psychology. He understood motivation, what drove loyalty, what incited betrayal, and what could be leveraged to achieve compliance. Partners, lieutenants, and even rivals were treated not merely as tools, but as participants in a system where their personal interests were aligned with his broader objectives. Those who prospered under the system became loyal allies. Those who threatened its stability were neutralized decisively but strategically. In this way, Luciano's empire functioned like a complex organism, each part interdependent yet guided by a central intelligence. Another aspect of his approach was risk management. Luciano minimized exposure to law enforcement by compartmentalizing operations, using intermediaries, and ensuring plausible deniability wherever possible. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he avoided unnecessary attention, understanding that visibility often invited danger. By controlling both operational and perceptual aspects of his empire, he could maintain influence while reducing vulnerability. This disciplined approach further distinguished him from the reckless, blood-soaked methods of prior generations. By the mid-1930s, Luciano's business empire spanned bootlegging, gambling, unions, vice, and narcotics, all operating with unprecedented organization and efficiency. What had once been chaotic, fragmented criminal activity had been transformed into a network of interconnected, profitable ventures. Each element reinforced the other, creating both financial power and strategic leverage over rivals, allies, and institutions alike. Luciano's operations were no longer street-level hustles. They were a sophisticated, multi-layered enterprise, designed to endure, expand, and dominate. Ultimately, this phase of Luciano's career demonstrates the full extent of his brilliance as a criminal strategist. He took opportunity in chaos and imposed structure. He turned risk into profit and unpredictability into control. And he did so with a vision that extended far beyond immediate gain, anticipating future challenges and positioning his empire to adapt and thrive. Luciano was no longer merely a gangster. He was a master of organized crime, a visionary whose systems transformed the underworld into a professional enterprise capable of generating wealth, influence, and power on a scale never seen before. His genius lay not just in violence or audacity, but in the methodical, intelligent, and strategic orchestration of criminal enterprise, an orchestration that would set the standard for decades to come. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, the underworld of New York had become a simmering cauldron of tension, ambition, and latent violence. While Luciano was busy building the foundations of his empire, rival factions and traditional bosses continued to jockey for control, sometimes openly and often in deadly secrecy. The hidden war of this era was not always visible to the public eye. It unfolded in smoky back rooms, whispered deals, and calculated hits designed to shift power without inviting attention. Luciano was acutely aware that consolidation of power required both subtlety and aggression, a careful balancing act between coercion, negotiation, and psychological dominance. The Castellamarese War had officially ended with the assassinations of Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, but the fallout created an unstable environment that required constant vigilance. Many of the old bosses and their loyalists were unwilling to accept the new order, resenting Luciano's vision and fearing the loss of their influence. These tensions created a hidden battlefield where alliances shifted like sand, and betrayal could come from any direction. Luciano, ever the strategist, navigated this terrain with meticulous care. He knew that overt aggression could provoke retaliatory strikes, destabilize operations, or draw unwanted attention from law enforcement. Therefore, every move was calculated, every relationship carefully managed, and every decision weighed against both short-term gain and long-term stability. This period also saw increased scrutiny from law enforcement, who were beginning to understand that organized crime was more than random acts of violence. It was a network capable of influencing politics, unions, and even legitimate business. The FBI and local police forces were growing increasingly sophisticated, developing surveillance techniques, informants, and legal strategies designed to disrupt the Mafia's operations. Luciano understood that visibility was dangerous. He adopted measures to protect himself and his allies, using intermediaries to conduct business, limiting personal exposure, and cultivating a network of trusted confidants who could execute his directives without compromise. In essence, he created an operational firewall around himself, allowing the empire to function even as pressures mounted from multiple directions. The hidden war was not only about survival, it was also psychological. Luciano was a master of perception, manipulating both allies and enemies to maintain an upper hand. He projected calm where others were frantic, confidence where others were fearful, and inevitability where rivals hoped for chaos. This psychological dominance allowed him to neutralize threats before they became crises. Potential adversaries often hesitated, unsure whether to challenge him openly or accept his rising authority, giving Luciano time to consolidate alliances and strengthen his position. Every interaction became a negotiation of power, where fear, respect, and loyalty were constantly calibrated. Internal conflicts within the Mafia further complicated the landscape. Younger, ambitious members often clashed with older bosses who resisted modernization and cross-ethnic cooperation. Luciano's ability to navigate these tensions was critical. He cultivated loyalty among younger operatives by offering opportunities, rewards, and recognition while simultaneously marginalizing those unwilling to adapt. This approach not only minimized internal dissent but also created a culture in which competence and obedience were valued above tradition, ethnicity, or seniority. In doing so, he gradually replaced the old guard with a generation aligned with his vision for a more organized, profitable, and sustainable criminal enterprise. External pressures were equally challenging. Political corruption, union disputes, and rival criminal organizations required constant attention. Luciano's strategic mind allowed him to anticipate moves by outsiders and respond preemptively. Whether negotiating peace with rival gangs, bribing officials to secure operations, or quietly eliminating threats, every action was part of a broader plan to maintain stability while expanding influence. Luciano's ability to operate in the shadows, orchestrating events behind the scenes, allowed his empire to flourish even in times of apparent instability. During this period, Luciano also honed the art of risk management. Violence, while sometimes necessary, was never arbitrary. Hits were calculated to achieve maximum effect with minimum exposure. Alliances were maintained through a combination of incentive, loyalty, and threat, ensuring that every participant had a vested interest in the system's stability. Luciano's foresight extended to anticipating law enforcement tactics, rival strategies, and the shifting dynamics of public perception. In doing so, he maintained control over both the operational and psychological dimensions of the underworld, creating a resilient network capable of withstanding internal and external pressures alike. Perhaps most importantly, this hidden war demonstrated Luciano's ability to think several steps ahead of his rivals. He understood that true power was not only in executing violent acts or controlling revenue streams but in managing perception, building networks, and creating structures that endured beyond individual confrontations. Every deal, every threat, and every alliance was a deliberate move on a chessboard he saw in its entirety. This strategic depth separated him from other gangsters, allowing him to consolidate authority without unnecessary exposure or wasted resources. By the mid-1930s, the hidden war had solidified Luciano's dominance. Rivalries that once threatened to erupt into open conflict were neutralized through negotiation, strategic elimination, or co-optation. The underworld, once chaotic and fractured, was slowly becoming a system governed by rules, loyalty, and centralized influence. Luciano's ability to operate invisibly, to manipulate both individuals and factions, and to maintain control through foresight and psychological acumen, established him not only as a survivor but as the central architect of a new era in organized crime. In this period, the city itself became a silent witness to Luciano's mastery. While the streets still ran with violence, much of the true battles were fought in shadows, in whispered conversations, in alliances brokered over discreet dinners, and in silent threats that needed no words. It was a war that few understood, but one that determined the future of organized crime in America. Luciano's navigation of this hidden war showcased the essence of his brilliance, the ability to blend strategy, psychology, and operational precision into an enduring system of control. Through patience, foresight, and relentless calculation, he turned chaos into order, uncertainty into opportunity, and danger into a platform for consolidation. This was the period in which Luciano became more than a gangster. He became the master strategist, the invisible hand shaping the underworld according to his vision. Despite his meticulously constructed empire and his careful navigation of rivalries, Luciano's ascent was not immune to the forces of law and circumstance. By the late 1930s, the very structures that had enabled him to thrive, his network of alliances, his profitable enterprises, and his highly visible influence, had also made him a target. Law enforcement, long frustrated by the chaotic and elusive nature of organized crime, had begun to focus their attention on him. Prosecutors and police officers recognized that dismantling Luciano's operations required taking down the architect himself. While other mobsters had been content to operate under the radar, Luciano's visibility, power, and influence made him both indispensable and vulnerable. The fall of even a man as cunning as Lucky Luciano was now a real possibility. The first cracks in his armor appeared in the form of investigations into his business dealings. Luciano's empire, sprawling and complex, touched multiple sectors: bootlegging, gambling, union racketeering, prostitution, and narcotics. Each of these enterprises involved hundreds of people, and each connection carried risk. Law enforcement had begun compiling evidence, leveraging informants, and exploiting minor errors to build a case. While Luciano had always been careful to insulate himself from direct involvement, the sheer scale of his operations meant that traces of criminal activity inevitably led back to him. The network he had so brilliantly constructed now contained seeds of exposure that could, and eventually would, be turned against him. Simultaneously, the political environment was shifting. Public outrage over organized crime, sensationalized by the press, created pressure on prosecutors to achieve high-profile convictions. Politicians sought to demonstrate that no one, not even the powerful mob boss, was beyond the reach of the law. This convergence of legal pressure, media scrutiny, and political ambition meant that Luciano's empire, which had thrived in the shadows, was being brought into the harsh light of public attention. The same visibility that had once reinforced his authority now rendered him vulnerable to legal scrutiny, making the hidden war he had so masterfully navigated increasingly dangerous. Betrayal also played a role in Luciano's decline. The underworld was rife with opportunists who, motivated by fear or ambition, were willing to cooperate with authorities to protect themselves or gain advantage. Despite Luciano's ability to command loyalty, even the most disciplined networks contain weak links. Informants began to emerge, providing evidence that would ultimately implicate him. These betrayals, often subtle and insidious, eroded the protective barriers he had established and exposed him to prosecution. The very relationships he had painstakingly cultivated as part of his empire were now avenues for his undoing, a stark reminder that power built on networks of human loyalty is always precarious. Luciano's personal behavior also contributed to his vulnerability. While he was calculated and disciplined in most respects, his ambition and confidence occasionally manifested as risk-taking that drew attention. Meetings with influential figures, extravagant displays of wealth, and associations with high-profile criminals all increased his visibility. The same charisma and strategic brilliance that had enabled him to command respect also made him a prominent target. Authorities were no longer chasing an abstract network of criminals, they were pursuing the man at its center, and the public fascination with his persona intensified the pressure. The legal apparatus finally caught up with him in the form of an arrest for compulsory prostitution, an indictment that would expose the breadth of his empire and mark the beginning of his downfall. Luciano's network, which had been his greatest strength, now complicated his defense, as the prosecution leveraged the activities of associates to implicate him. The media framed him as the embodiment of criminal power, a narrative that both reinforced public perception and increased the stakes of his trial. For the first time, the architect of organized crime faced the full weight of the law, and the empire he had so carefully built was at risk of unraveling. Psychologically, this period was a profound challenge for Luciano. He was accustomed to controlling outcomes, manipulating perception, and orchestrating events to his advantage. Yet now he faced forces largely beyond his immediate control, law enforcement, political pressure, and the unpredictable behavior of human actors within his network. For a man who had built his life on anticipation and calculated moves, the loss of control was both dangerous and humbling. The reality of vulnerability, of exposure, and of potential imprisonment brought an acute awareness of mortality and risk that few in his position ever experienced so directly. As the net tightened, the underworld itself reacted. Allies and rivals alike recalculated their positions, weighing whether to support him, abandon him, or leverage his situation for personal gain. Luciano's leadership faced its ultimate test. Could the empire endure the loss of its central figure, and could he maintain influence even as legal and social forces threatened to dismantle everything he had built? The answers were uncertain, and the stakes had never been higher. Every decision, every move carried consequences not just for him personally but for the entire network he had orchestrated. Ultimately, the fall began not with a single act of violence or betrayal, but with the convergence of law, politics, and human unpredictability. Luciano, the master strategist, found himself at the center of a storm he could not fully control. The structures, alliances, and systems he had created to protect and empower him were now both tools and liabilities. The underworld, once a domain in which he held unchallenged authority, became a theater of scrutiny and vulnerability. The beginning of his decline was a complex interplay of external pressure, internal betrayal, and the immutable consequences of visibility and ambition. A turning point in the life of a man who had once seemed invincible, a reminder that even the most meticulously constructed empires are susceptible to the forces of circumstance, law, and human frailty. The trial of Lucky Luciano marked a dramatic turning point not just in his life, but in the history of organized crime in America. By the time he faced the courtroom, his empire was the subject of national fascination and public outrage. Newspapers painted him as the embodiment of vice and corruption, a man who had manipulated entire systems for personal gain. Headlines screamed about prostitution rings, union manipulation, and the far-reaching influence of the Mafia. The media frenzy surrounding the trial amplified the stakes, creating an environment where the outcome would reverberate far beyond the walls of the courtroom. For Luciano, the trial was no longer just a legal battle, it was a contest over reputation, legacy, and survival. The charges against him were serious and wide-ranging. Luciano was accused of controlling a vast network of prostitution, of profiting from illegal activities, and of exercising influence that reached deep into unions, politics, and the business world. The prosecution painted a picture of a man whose ambitions were limitless and whose methods were both ruthless and sophisticated. Witnesses, informants, and former associates were brought forward to testify against him, revealing the intricate web of connections that had once been the source of his power. For the first time, the carefully hidden inner workings of his empire were laid bare, exposing both operational details and personal vulnerabilities. Luciano's defense faced immense challenges. The legal system was heavily stacked against figures like him, and the sensationalism of the press created additional pressure on judges and jurors alike. Yet, the trial also highlighted Luciano's intelligence and strategic thinking. He understood the importance of perception and public image, even in the courtroom. Every word, every gesture, and every interaction was calculated to project calm, confidence, and control. He was not merely a defendant. He was a master manipulator operating under intense scrutiny, seeking to influence opinion and navigate the treacherous landscape of high-profile prosecution. Despite the defense's efforts, the weight of evidence, the testimonies of insiders, and the broader societal demand for accountability proved overwhelming. The court depicted Luciano not just as a criminal, but as the orchestrator of a national menace. His empire, which had once been a source of power and profit, now became evidence against him. The very systems he had built to protect and consolidate his influence, his network of lieutenants, alliances, and operational structures, were now leveraged by prosecutors to secure a conviction. It was a paradoxical moment. The genius that had elevated him was now being used to bring him down. The trial was also a spectacle of psychology and human behavior. Luciano, ever the observer, analyzed the demeanor of jurors, the strategies of prosecutors, and the reactions of the public. He knew that intimidation and presence could influence outcomes as much as facts and law. Even as witnesses spoke against him, he remained composed, projecting the image of a man accustomed to power and unshaken by adversity. This psychological sophistication, while not enough to prevent conviction, demonstrated the same strategic mind that had allowed him to rise from the streets to the apex of organized crime. Public reaction to the trial was intense. Society was fascinated, horrified, and captivated by the notion that one man could control so much of the underworld. Luciano became both villain and legend in the collective imagination. Newspapers and radio broadcasts followed each development closely, turning the courtroom into a theater of morality, power, and criminality. The trial became symbolic, a confrontation between the forces of law and the organized genius of a criminal empire, a clash that highlighted the tension between ambition, morality, and justice in American society. Ultimately, Luciano was convicted and the sentence was severe. The courtroom drama, combined with the media spectacle and the breadth of evidence, ensured that there could be no leniency. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, a punishment that symbolized both societal condemnation and the fragility of even the most carefully constructed criminal empire. The conviction was more than a personal defeat. It was a watershed moment for organized crime in America, demonstrating that the very systems which empowered a man like Luciano could also be turned against him. It underscored the inherent risks of visibility, ambition, and the use of human networks, revealing that no matter how sophisticated the strategy, external forces could alter the trajectory of even the most powerful figures. The trial also exposed deeper truths about the psychology of power. Luciano's rise had been based on calculation, influence, and the careful orchestration of loyalty. Yet, in the courtroom he faced an environment where the rules were different, and the variables uncontrollable. The law, public opinion, and the unpredictable nature of human testimony combined to create a scenario that even a master strategist could not fully manipulate. This phase of his life highlighted the limitations of control, the vulnerability inherent in leadership, and the consequences of living at the apex of an empire built on human networks. In reflection, the trial of Lucky Luciano was more than a legal proceeding. It was a crucible that tested the structures, alliances, and intellect he had built over decades. It revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of his empire, illustrating how brilliance and ambition can both elevate and expose a man. The courtroom became the stage upon which the consequences of power, loyalty, and strategic genius were played out in public view. By the end of the trial, Luciano's world had changed irrevocably. He was a convicted man, but his influence, legacy, and the systems he had designed would continue to shape organized crime for generations, underscoring the paradox that even in defeat, the architect's blueprint endured. Even behind the cold, unyielding walls of prison, Luciano's influence did not wane. Unlike many criminals whose power evaporates once they are removed from the streets, Luciano understood that true control relied not solely on physical presence but on the systems, relationships, and perception he had meticulously cultivated. From his cell, he continued to orchestrate operations, issuing orders through trusted intermediaries, maintaining communication with lieutenants, and ensuring that the empire he had built remained intact. His imprisonment was not an end. It was a test of his ability to exercise power under constraints, a challenge he approached with the same strategic mind that had defined his rise. Luciano's ability to exert influence from behind bars was rooted in his pre-existing networks. The commission, the structured hierarchy of organized crime, and the loyalty he had cultivated among key figures allowed him to operate at a distance. He relied on intermediaries who understood both his directives and the broader vision of the empire. These lieutenants, motivated by loyalty, fear, and mutual benefit, acted as extensions of Luciano himself. Orders that might have required personal oversight were delegated, but the outcomes were carefully monitored. In this way, the operations of gambling, union racketeering, bootlegging, and vice continued with remarkable continuity, illustrating the durability of the systems he had built. Communication was key. Luciano understood that information was power, and even within the confines of prison he maintained channels to the outside world. Letters, trusted visitors, and subtle intermediaries allowed him to monitor events, influence decisions, and respond to crises. He remained intimately aware of rival factions, law enforcement movements, and the internal dynamics of his organization. By staying informed and strategically engaging with the outside world, Luciano ensured that his physical absence did not translate into a loss of authority. In essence, he had transformed incarceration into a controlled environment from which he could continue to exercise influence, demonstrating the adaptability and resilience of his leadership. Psychologically, this period highlighted Luciano's mastery of perception. He cultivated an image of calm control, projecting confidence and inevitability even while confined. Allies and rivals alike were aware that imprisonment had not diminished his authority. This projection of unshaken power served multiple purposes. It reinforced loyalty among his followers, deterred potential challenges, and reminded both friends and enemies that Luciano's influence transcended physical barriers. Even when the legal system sought to contain him, he found ways to manipulate perception, ensuring that his aura of dominance remained intact. Luciano also used his time in prison strategically to reflect, plan, and prepare for the future. Unlike many incarcerated leaders who succumbed to despair or distraction, he approached confinement as an opportunity to consolidate knowledge and refine strategy. He studied the changing dynamics of law enforcement, monitored emerging opportunities in the underworld, and anticipated shifts in alliances. By doing so, he remained several steps ahead of both rivals and authorities, ensuring that he could reassert influence the moment circumstances allowed. In this way, prison became not a limitation but a controlled environment for observation and long-term planning. The resilience of Luciano's control also relied on fear and respect, carefully balanced with loyalty and incentives. Intermediaries and lieutenants understood that obedience was rewarded, while deviation or betrayal carried severe consequences. This combination ensured that directives were followed precisely, maintaining operational continuity and minimizing the risk of disruption. Luciano's understanding of human behavior, honed over decades of street-level observation and high-stakes maneuvering, allowed him to maintain authority without direct physical oversight. His empire functioned not merely on orders but on cultivated incentives, psychological alignment, and strategic oversight. During this period, Luciano also navigated external pressures skillfully. Law enforcement continued to monitor his operations, and rival factions remained potential threats. Yet he leveraged the systems he had built to minimize exposure and maintain operational efficiency. His ability to anticipate moves, delegate effectively, and manipulate both perception and relationships allowed him to stay ahead of potential threats. Even as authorities sought to dismantle his empire, Luciano remained the central node through which power flowed, demonstrating the extraordinary reach of his organizational genius. The period of incarceration also underscored the durability of Luciano's leadership philosophy, that systems, structure, and loyalty are more enduring than physical presence or raw force. While rivals might rely on intimidation or direct oversight, Luciano had engineered a network capable of functioning autonomously, yet responsive to strategic guidance. This approach ensured that his absence did not lead to collapse. Instead, it tested and validated the robustness of the empire he had constructed. In this sense, his imprisonment became a proof of concept, demonstrating that his vision of organized crime as a disciplined, resilient enterprise was not only theoretical but practical. Luciano's continued influence from prison also had psychological ramifications for the broader underworld. Allies remained loyal because they recognized the value of the system he had created. Rivals remained cautious because his authority remained intact. The aura of power that surrounded him, even behind bars, reinforced the perception of invincibility. Luciano had effectively created a model in which leadership was defined not by physical proximity, but by foresight, organization, and the ability to orchestrate outcomes remotely. This approach redefined the nature of control within organized crime, highlighting the primacy of systems over individuals. By the end of his incarceration period, it was clear that Luciano had preserved both his empire and his influence despite significant constraints. His ability to maintain operational continuity, command loyalty, and project authority from prison solidified his reputation as a strategist of unparalleled skill. While the law had succeeded in removing him from the streets, it had failed to diminish the structures he had built or the influence he wielded. Luciano's time behind bars demonstrated that true power is not merely exercised through physical presence or force, but through the careful design of systems, networks, and perception, a principle that would define both his legacy and the enduring strength of the American Mafia. After years behind bars, Luciano faced the next phase of his life, exile. His imprisonment had not destroyed his influence, but it had made clear the fragility of personal power in the face of law enforcement and public scrutiny. In 1946, under mounting political and legal pressure, Luciano was deported to Italy, a country he had left as a young man and where the underworld landscape was both familiar and alien. Exile presented a new set of challenges: distance from his American empire, limited legal recourse, and the psychological strain of being removed from the arena where he had exercised so much control. Yet, as always, Luciano approached this phase strategically, seeking to convert adversity into opportunity, and to retain influence despite geographic separation. Italy in the mid-20th century was a nation in transition. The scars of war, political upheaval, and economic instability created both constraints and opportunities. Luciano's return to Sicily and later Naples placed him in a context where organized crime was powerful but less sophisticated than the structured networks he had created in the United States. He had to navigate local power dynamics, contend with entrenched families, and manage the tension between old-world traditions and his modern, systematized vision of organized crime. Unlike in America, where he had been the central architect of the commission and controlled vast networks, in Italy he was initially an outsider, a foreigner with experience, ambition, and reputation but limited authority. The challenge was to assert influence without provoking hostility from established factions. Despite these constraints, Luciano began to leverage his knowledge, reputation, and relationships to re-establish a position of authority. He cultivated contacts within local criminal networks, identifying ambitious figures who were receptive to his vision of structured, strategic operations. By offering guidance, mentorship, and strategic insights, he extended his influence indirectly, transforming from a direct operator to a consigliere-like figure whose counsel shaped decisions across multiple factions. His understanding of organizational design, risk management, and psychology allowed him to remain relevant, even at a distance from the American underworld he had once commanded. Luciano's exile also coincided with global developments that offered unique opportunities. During World War II, the Allied invasion of Italy created chaos, displacement, and a need for local knowledge and influence. Luciano, who had connections and intelligence about ports, networks, and local systems, became a resource for U.S. authorities seeking to stabilize operations in southern Italy. This collaboration, though controversial, enhanced his strategic importance and demonstrated his capacity to navigate political and operational complexities beyond the realm of crime. Even in exile, Luciano's network and reputation allowed him to act as a bridge between worlds, criminal, political, and military, underscoring his adaptability and strategic vision. While geographically removed from the United States, Luciano maintained connections with his American network. Trusted lieutenants, intermediaries, and the enduring framework of the commission ensured that his influence persisted. Orders and guidance flowed through carefully managed channels, allowing him to impact operations, resolve disputes, and maintain loyalty among key figures. In this way, Luciano's empire was not confined by borders. His systems and relationships transcended physical separation, illustrating the durability of the organizational structures he had built over decades. Exile, while a personal setback, became a laboratory for demonstrating the scalability and resilience of his model of organized crime. Psychologically, exile demanded reflection and adaptation. Luciano confronted the limitations of physical power, the inevitability of aging, and the shifting landscape of global organized crime. He recognized that direct control was no longer feasible and that influence had to be exerted through strategy, mentorship, and the careful cultivation of intermediaries. This phase of life highlighted the evolution of his leadership style, from hands-on orchestrator to strategic overseer, from visible power broker to shadow architect of influence. Luciano's capacity to adjust to circumstances without relinquishing authority exemplified his resilience and deep understanding of human behavior. Exile also prompted a philosophical transformation. Removed from the immediate pressures of American law enforcement and the daily operations of his empire, Luciano began to reflect on legacy, mortality, and the enduring principles of power. He contemplated the successes and failures of his career, the human cost of his rise, and the structural genius that had allowed him to endure where others had fallen. This period of introspection did not diminish his ambition. Rather, it refined it, guiding him toward a mode of influence that relied less on personal action and more on strategic foresight, systemic thinking, and psychological leverage. Despite the distance, Luciano continued to exert influence on American organized crime. Through letters, emissaries, and trusted operatives, he guided decisions, mediated conflicts, and ensured that his vision of structured, disciplined operations persisted. He monitored rivalries, anticipated shifts in alliances, and advised on expansion opportunities. In effect, Luciano had transformed the nature of leadership within organized crime. Authority no longer required physical presence, but rather mastery of networks, systems, and human behavior. Exile proved that the empire he had built was not only durable but adaptable, capable of surviving and evolving even when its architect was removed from its epicenter. By the end of this period, Luciano's life in exile represented both limitation and triumph. While he could no longer directly oversee his empire in America, he had maintained relevance, influence, and strategic authority. His ability to operate across distance, adapt to a foreign environment, and leverage opportunities in the midst of political and social upheaval illustrated the enduring power of his intellect and organizational vision. Exile was a crucible in which his genius was tested and validated, proving that the structures, alliances, and strategies he had designed were not merely tools for immediate gain, but systems capable of sustaining influence, shaping events, and cementing legacy long after the man himself had been removed from the front lines. Lucky Luciano's legacy is perhaps the most enduring testament to his brilliance, audacity, and foresight. Even decades after his death, the systems he created, the strategies he employed, and the organizational model he championed continued to influence organized crime around the world. While his life was marked by violence, betrayal, and legal persecution, the principles he implemented transcended his personal narrative, transforming the underworld from a chaotic collection of street gangs into a disciplined, highly structured, and remarkably resilient enterprise. His impact was not limited to the immediate profits or territorial control he amassed. It lay in the enduring blueprint he left behind, a blueprint that would define the nature of modern organized crime for generations. At the core of Luciano's legacy was the Commission, a governing body that introduced unprecedented levels of order, predictability, and strategy to the Mafia. By creating a council of families, codifying rules for conflict resolution, and balancing autonomy with centralized oversight, Luciano engineered a system that minimized internecine warfare while maximizing profit. This approach not only stabilized New York's underworld but also provided a replicable model for organized crime in other cities and countries. Through the Commission, Luciano institutionalized power in a way that no previous gangster had, demonstrating that influence could be systematized and maintained across time, territory, and generations. His vision was not simply for dominance. It was for continuity, ensuring that organized crime could endure beyond any single individual. Luciano's genius extended beyond structure to operational sophistication. He recognized the value of diversification, turning disparate criminal activities, bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, union racketeering, and narcotics, into coordinated, profitable ventures. Each enterprise was not an isolated hustle but a component of a broader system designed to reinforce control, generate revenue, and manage risk. By treating criminal activity like a business, Luciano elevated the Mafia from a disorganized network of violent opportunists to a disciplined, professionalized organization capable of scaling operations and maintaining resilience under pressure. This transformation reflected both strategic acumen and deep psychological insight. Power, profit, and loyalty were inextricably linked, and mastery over all three was essential for enduring success. The psychological dimension of Luciano's legacy is equally significant. He understood human behavior with extraordinary acuity, how to cultivate loyalty, instill fear, leverage ambition, and neutralize threats without unnecessary conflict. His ability to manipulate perception, maintain authority remotely, and command respect through a combination of strategic foresight and interpersonal skill set a standard for leadership within criminal networks. Luciano demonstrated that influence is as much about intellect and relationships as it is about muscle, and that a leader who can anticipate human behavior has a far greater chance of maintaining control. His methods created a culture in which obedience was aligned with self-interest, and loyalty was reinforced by both reward and consequence, a sophisticated psychological architecture underpinning operational control. Luciano's influence also reshaped the relationship between organized crime and broader society. By integrating criminal enterprise with unions, political structures, and legitimate business ventures, he blurred the lines between legality and illegality in ways that enhanced both profit and stability. He understood the power of discretion, negotiation, and strategic alliances, cultivating influence without always resorting to violence. This nuanced approach allowed organized crime to exert impact far beyond the street, embedding itself within economic and political systems while remaining largely insulated from direct law enforcement interference. Luciano's model demonstrated that power could be systemic, adaptive, and enduring, less about intimidation and more about integration, leverage, and foresight. Even after his exile and eventual death, Luciano's structural innovations continued to govern organized crime. The Commission endured, disputes were mediated through established procedures, and operational systems he had implemented remained in place. Future generations of mobsters inherited a playbook that allowed them to navigate alliances, manage enterprises, and resolve conflicts efficiently. Luciano's foresight ensured that his influence persisted in the absence of his physical presence, a testament to the enduring efficacy of the organizational and psychological systems he had engineered. His life illustrates the rare combination of tactical brilliance, strategic vision, and organizational genius necessary to create a legacy that transcends mortality. Luciano's legacy also carries a cautionary element, highlighting the risks inherent in power, visibility, and human networks. His eventual arrest, conviction, and deportation remind us that even the most carefully constructed empires are vulnerable to legal, social, and human forces beyond control. The same networks that enabled his rise could be leveraged against him, and the visibility that reinforced his authority ultimately exposed him to scrutiny. Yet, this vulnerability does not diminish his accomplishments. Rather, it underscores the complexity of his genius. Luciano's life was a study in both the possibilities and limitations of structured power, demonstrating that enduring influence requires not just ambition but foresight, adaptability, and strategic resilience. In reflection, Lucky Luciano was more than a gangster. He was an architect of systems, a strategist of human behavior, and a visionary who redefined organized crime. His legacy is evident in the operational sophistication, structural order, and psychological insight that characterize modern criminal enterprises. He proved that power could be engineered, influence could be systematized, and criminal enterprise could be elevated to a level of professional, enduring organization. Luciano's blueprint transformed the underworld, leaving a mark that extends far beyond his era, illustrating that the true measure of a leader is not just in conquest, but in the enduring structures, strategies, and principles they leave behind. Lucky Luciano's final years were marked by reflection and the quiet exercise of influence from afar. Exiled to Italy, far from the streets of New York he once ruled, he maintained connections with his American network through trusted intermediaries, letters, and emissaries. While he could no longer oversee daily operations directly, the systems and structures he had built allowed him to continue shaping decisions and guiding loyal associates. Exile tested his adaptability, forcing him to rely on indirect influence and strategic foresight rather than physical presence. During this period, Luciano's reputation continued to grow. In the United States, he remained a symbol of organized crime, a figure both feared and mythologized. Allies respected his enduring authority, while rivals approached cautiously, aware that his guidance still carried weight. Luciano's understanding of human behavior allowed him to project control, instill loyalty, and maintain his empire's stability despite geographic separation. The years in exile also prompted personal reflection. Removed from the immediacy of power, he considered the consequences of his ambition, the betrayals, violence, and human costs that had accompanied his rise. Though he could not reverse the past, he refined his understanding of influence, focusing on strategy, mentorship, and systemic control. Luciano demonstrated that real power depends not on physical presence, but on well-designed networks, psychological insight, and the ability to operate through intermediaries. Even in his final years, Luciano remained engaged in the evolution of organized crime. His guidance shaped decisions, resolved disputes, and ensured continuity, proving that his vision of a disciplined, structured underworld endured beyond his direct participation. When he died in 1962, his personal story ended, but the systems he created, the commission, operational hierarchies, and strategic principles, continued to govern organized crime. His final chapter illustrates that legacy is defined not only by conquest, but by the enduring structures, strategy, and influence a leader leaves behind.